You don't usually notice it at first. There's no alarm, no breakdown, no dramatic collapse. It starts quietly. A strange fatigue, not physical, not exactly emotional either. Just a sense that something about your life feels rehearsed. You wake up, you move through the day, you do what's expected of you. And yet, somewhere beneath all of that, a question keeps surfacing. When did this become my life? Most people push that question away. They distract themselves. They call it overthinking. They tell themselves they should be grateful. But that question doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the part of you that remembers something you've forgotten. From the moment you were born, you were shaped. Not violently, not intentionally, just gradually. You were rewarded for certain behaviors, corrected for others, loved more when you adapted. Slowly, subtly, you learned something crucial. Some parts of you were acceptable, others were not. So you did what every intelligent child does. You adjusted. You learned when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to smile, when to hide. And without realizing it, you began constructing a version of yourself that worked, a version that survived. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask. Not a lie, not fake, a social adaptation. The face you present to the world so you can belong. And the persona works, it really does. It gets you approval, stability, safety, but it comes at a cost most people don't notice until much later. Because every trait you suppress, every impulse you silence, every emotion you decide is too much doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere. That place is what Jung called the shadow. The shadow isn't evil. It isn't dark in the way movies portray it. The shadow is simply everything you were not allowed to be. Your anger, your ambition, your selfishness, your sensitivity, your hunger, your desire to say no, your desire to leave, your desire to want more. And here's the part nobody tells you. The shadow doesn't punish you for having it. It waits. At first, the shadow is quiet. You feel it as irritation, restlessness, a vague dissatisfaction you can't explain. You might say things like, "I don't know why I feel like this. Something feels off. I should be happier than I am." But as time passes, the shadow grows heavier. Because energy that isn't lived doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And when it accumulates long enough, it begins to leak. It leaks into your relationships. You feel inexplicably triggered by certain people, people who remind you, unconsciously, of traits you've buried in yourself. You judge them, resent them, dismiss them, not because they're wrong, but because they're free in ways you're not. It leaks into your motivation. You procrastinate, self-sabotage, lose interest right when things start to matter. Not because you're lazy, not because you lack discipline, but because part of you refuses to keep playing a role it never chose. And it leaks into your sense of identity. You look at your life from the outside and think, "This is what I wanted, right?" But the question feels hollow. Because deep down, you know something uncomfortable. You didn't consciously choose most of this. You inherited it, adapted to it, drifted into it. This is where most people stop listening, because the next realization is dangerous. Not dramatic dangerous, identity dangerous. If the life you're living is partially a performance, then the discomfort you feel isn't a flaw, it's a signal. And if that's true, then fixing your feelings isn't the answer. Listening to them is. And that's where the real journey begins. Not with improvement, not with productivity, not with becoming better, but with confronting the parts of yourself you've been avoiding your entire life. And that confrontation changes everything. In the next part, we'll talk about why most people sense this truth and still run from it. Why awareness alone doesn't free you, why insight often makes things worse before they get better, and why the shadow doesn't ask for perfection, only honesty. Why most people never change, even when they know. You already know more than you think. That's the uncomfortable truth. Most people don't fail to change because they lack insight. They fail because insight threatens the very identity they depend on to survive. You've felt this. Moments of clarity arrive, usually late at night, or in silence, or after something breaks. You see patterns, you recognize avoidance, you realize certain choices aren't honest anymore. And for a brief moment, everything feels exposed. Then, nothing happens. Life continues, habits resume, the realization fades. And eventually you tell yourself, I guess it wasn't that important. But it was. Here's the part few are willing to admit. Awareness is not liberating, it's destabilizing. The moment you truly see yourself, you can't unsee what staying the same would mean. And that's terrifying. Because change doesn't just add something new, it takes things away. If you changed, really changed, you might disappoint people who rely on the version of you that never says no. You might outgrow relationships that were built on your compliance. You might have to admit that some of your suffering wasn't bad luck. It was self-betrayal. And that realization cuts deeper than ignorance ever could. So the mind does something clever. It turns insight into entertainment. You watch videos, you read books, you collect language, you learn the words shadow, trauma, conditioning, inner child, ego. And slowly, unconsciously, knowledge replaces action. You understand your patterns, but continue repeating them. You explain your wounds, but never confront them. This is not growth, it's camouflage. Carl Jung warned about this. He observed that people often use psychology not to transform, but to protect the ego from transformation. They become fluent in their pain, articulate about their limitations, sophisticated in their explanations, but nothing moves, because real change is not elegant, it's humiliating. Real change feels like not knowing who you are anymore, losing certainty before gaining clarity, standing without a script. It feels like incompetence, like regression, like risk. Which is why most people don't avoid change because they're weak. They avoid it because they're attached. Attached to being seen a certain way. Attached to being the reliable one, the good one, the strong one, the reasonable one. Even attached to being the wounded one. Here's a difficult question. Don't answer it out loud. Who would you be if you stopped being who you've been rewarded for being? Not admired, not needed, not depended on, just honest. That question has consequences, and the psyche knows it. So it delays, it rationalizes, it waits for a better time. But time doesn't loosen identity, it reinforces it. This is why people often change only when they're forced, after a breakdown, a loss, a betrayal, an illness, a collapse they didn't plan. Not because suffering is noble, but because it removes the illusion of control. It strips away the persona, and suddenly the shadow steps forward. The shadow doesn't ask politely, it shows up as burnout, resentment, apathy, emotional numbness, irrational anger, chronic dissatisfaction. Not to punish you, but to be acknowledged. Because what you refuse to face consciously, you will meet unconsciously, and unconsciously, it's always harsher. This is the lie modern self-improvement sells, that you can become more without losing anything. But psychologically, that's impossible. Growth requires sacrifice, not of happiness, but of identity, of outdated self-images, of roles you've outgrown,
of masks that once protected you but now imprison you. Most people sense this and quietly decide, "I'll stay as I am. It's not perfect, but it's familiar." And the psyche notes that decision. Then, slowly, it begins to withdraw energy. Motivation fades, meaning thins, joy feels conditional. Not as punishment, but as pressure. Because the unconscious has one priority: wholeness. Not comfort, not status, not approval. Wholeness. And if you won't move towards it willingly, it will pull you there through tension. In the next part, we'll talk about how the shadow enforces this, why you project, why certain people trigger you irrationally, why your self-sabotage appears right before growth, and why your problems may actually be attempts at balance, not failures, signals. Part 3 is where things get personal, because once you understand projection, you can't blame the world the same way again. Part 3. The Shadow's Revenge, Projection, Triggers, and Self-Sabotage. If you're honest, there are people who irritate you more than they should, not because they harmed you, not because they're cruel, but because something about them gets under your skin. Their confidence, their laziness, their ambition, their emotional freedom, their selfishness, their softness. You might call it bad chemistry. Jung called it projection, and once you understand it, you lose a comfortable illusion. Projection happens when you encounter a trait you've disowned in yourself, not eliminated, not healed, buried. So when someone else lives it openly, even imperfectly, your psyche reacts, not rationally, emotionally, with judgment, with irritation, with moral superiority. That reaction is not about them, it's about what they are allowed to be that you are not. Think carefully. The people who anger you most are rarely your opposites. They are your unlived selves. The assertive one you call aggressive, the emotional one you call weak, the ambitious one you call shallow, the detached one you call cold. You're not seeing them clearly. You're seeing your own shadow wearing someone else's face. This is why blame feels so satisfying. Blame gives you distance. As long as the problem is out there, you don't have to confront the cost of your own restraint. But projection has a price, because every trait you condemn externally, you reinforce internally. You make yourself smaller to stay good, and the shadow keeps score. Eventually, it demands payment. This is where self-sabotage enters. You get close to something meaningful, a relationship, an opportunity, a direction, and suddenly you lose energy, you procrastinate, you create chaos, you pull away. You tell yourself, "I don't know why I do this." But the shadow knows. Self-sabotage is not self-hatred, it's self-correction, a crude attempt by the psyche to restore balance. If your conscious identity has become too narrow, too polite, too compliant, too controlled, the unconscious intervenes. Not intelligently, not gracefully, but effectively. Burnout is not always about workload. Sometimes it's about living too far from your truth. Depression is not always chemical. Sometimes it's grief for a self you never allowed to exist. Anxiety is not always fear of the future. Sometimes it's the tension of holding yourself back. Here's the uncomfortable part. Your symptoms are not random. They are patterned. They appear where you resist change. They intensify where you perform. They vanish briefly when you act honestly, even if that honesty creates conflict. The psyche rewards truth with energy, even painful truth, and it withdraws energy from lies, even polite ones. This is why positive thinking often fails. You cannot affirm your way out of a psychological imbalance. The shadow doesn't respond to motivation, it responds to integration. It doesn't want dominance, it wants representation. Integration does not mean acting out every impulse. It means acknowledging capacity, owning your anger without becoming cruel, owning your desire without becoming reckless, owning your ambition without becoming hollow. It means saying, "This is also me," without apology, without dramatization, without denial. Most people avoid this because it collapses moral simplicity. You're no longer the good one or the broken one. You become something harder to categorize, whole, which is inconvenient, unpredictable, less controllable to others and to yourself. This is why the shadow remains buried for so long, not because it's dangerous, but because it makes you honest, and honesty disrupts systems built on your silence.
In the final part, we'll talk about what integration actually looks like. Not spiritually, not abstractly, but practically. What changes, what doesn't, and why becoming whole does not make life easier, but makes it real. Part 4 is not comforting. It's stabilizing. And once you see it, you can't go back to pretending your way forward. Part 4. Integration. Becoming whole without losing yourself. If you followed this far, you might be expecting a breakthrough, a moment of clarity, a clean resolution, a sense of arrival. That expectation itself needs to be dismantled, because integration does not feel like triumph. It feels like sobriety. Integration is not becoming someone new. It's stopping the war against who you already are. And that changes the rules of everything. Let's be precise. Integration does not mean expressing every impulse, indulging every desire, abandoning responsibility, becoming selfish or chaotic. That's not wholeness. That's imbalance swinging in the opposite direction. Integration means capacity without compulsion. You don't act because you must. You don't repress because you're afraid. You choose. A person who has integrated their shadow can feel anger without needing to explode, can say no without justifying it, can want more without guilt, can disappoint others without collapsing. Not because they're hardened, but because they're no longer split. This is what most people misunderstand. They think wholeness makes you softer, or more spiritual, or more peaceful. Sometimes it does, but first, it makes you clear. And clarity is unsettling. You stop hiding behind confusion. You stop saying, "I don't know," when you actually do. You stop blaming circumstances you quietly tolerate. You stop waiting for permission you were never going to get. And this changes how people respond to you. Some respect it. Some resent it. Some disappear. That's not a failure. That's a recalibration. Here's the quiet truth. A lot of your relationships were built around who you were not allowed to be. When you integrate, you don't announce it. You don't explain it. You simply stop playing certain roles, and the system reacts. This is why integration feels lonely at first. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're no longer negotiating your identity. You're not trying to be understood. You're trying to be aligned. And alignment doesn't need applause. Practically, integration shows up in small, unglamorous ways. You notice tension sooner. You act earlier. You tolerate less internal contradiction. You don't wait until resentment builds. You don't let discomfort metastasize. You don't abandon yourself quietly anymore. That's the real shift. There's a sentence Jung returns to again and again in different forms.
What you do not make conscious will rule your life, and you will call it fate. Integration is how fate loses its grip, not because life becomes controllable, but because you stop being unconsciously controlled. This doesn't make you happier all the time, but it makes your suffering meaningful. You suffer for reasons you choose. You struggle in directions you respect. You fail honestly, and that kind of failure doesn't hollow you out. At some point, you realize something subtle but decisive. You are no longer obsessed with becoming better. You are focused on becoming real. You stop asking, "How do I fix myself?" and start asking, "Where am I not telling the truth?" That question changes your life quietly and permanently. The journey doesn't end here. It doesn't resolve. It doesn't complete itself. Wholeness is not a destination. It's a practice of refusal. Refusal to split yourself for comfort. Refusal to betray your own signals. Refusal to live half a life because it's easier to explain. And if you felt unsettled listening to this, good. That means something honest moved. Not inspiration, not motivation, recognition. Because the goal was never to improve you, it was to remind you of what you already sense, but have been postponing. And once you stop postponing yourself, life doesn't become simpler, but it becomes yours.